It was dawn in the misty mountains when I saw her. A starving bobcat, ribs showing, eyes trembling with a silent plea for life. I didn't know that stopping my truck that morning would change everything. I'm not going to hurt. In the heart of a brutal winter, a lost, wild soul found me. And, in the most unexpected way, she would end up saving a heart I thought had long gone cold. It was barely 6 o'clock in the morning when the first pale light crept through the fog that hung over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air was cold, the kind of chill that bites at old bones. I had been driving slowly down the narrow road that led to town, the tires crunching on frost, when I saw something move near the guardrail. At first I thought it was a bundle of rags, but then it shifted and two dim eyes blinked back at my headlights. A small bobcat, thin as a whisper, her fur patchy, her ribs showing with every breath. She stood frozen, trembling, one paw held awkwardly off the ground. For a long second, we just looked at each other through the mist. There was no sound, only the soft hum of the truck engine and the steady beat of my heart. I pulled over and killed the headlights. The road fell into a gray silence. When I opened the door, she didn't run, but she crouched lower, her body tight like a coiled spring. I could see her sides heaving, every breath a struggle. The poor thing must have been starving for days. Out here in the mountains, winter doesn't forgive the weak. I stepped closer, careful not to make sudden moves. Easy there, girl, I murmured. I'm not going to hurt you. My voice came out softer than I expected, maybe because I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. I reached into the truck and grabbed a small piece of jerky from my lunch bag, laying it on the cold asphalt between us. She didn't move, just stared, her pupils wide, her tail flicking nervously. Then, as the wind picked up and carried the smell of meat toward her, she crawled forward inch by inch. Her belly was almost touching the ground, her eyes never leaving mine. I could see the wound now. Her back leg had a nasty gash, raw and swollen. My stomach turned. She sniffed the food, hesitated, then began to eat tiny bites. At first, chewing slow like she couldn't believe it was real. I knelt a few feet away, not daring to breathe too loud. Something in me, the same quiet ache that's followed me since my wife passed, stirred awake. I'd built my cabin out here to be alone, but staring at that trembling creature, I felt loneliness. Staring back, when she finished, she looked up again. Our eyes met through the drifting fog. For just a moment I swear I saw more than fear in her gaze, something close to hope. Then, as if embarrassed, she limped backward and disappeared into the brush. I stayed there on the roadside for a while, hands numb from the cold, the jerky wrapper fluttering near my boot. Most folks would have driven on, but I couldn't. There was something about her, something that wouldn't let go. By the time I got home, the sun had fully broken over the ridge. The cabin felt emptier than usual. I lit the stove, poured myself a cup of coffee, and tried to push the image of those desperate eyes out of my mind. But they followed me everywhere I looked, reflected in the window, hidden in the curl of steam above my mug. Later that day, I packed a small basket with scraps of cooked chicken, a bottle of water, and an old wool blanket. I told myself I was just being decent, helping a wild creature through another night. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I drove back up the same road, stopping near the curve where I'd seen her. The forest was quiet, only the distant call of a raven echoing through the trees. I placed the food and blanket near the same spot and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I was about to leave when I heard it, a faint rustle, then the softest whimper.
She stepped
Out from behind a rock, limping worse than before. "Hey there," I whispered. "You came back." I stayed still, letting her
decide.
The scent of chicken must have been too much to resist. She crept closer, shivering, her breath visible in the cold air. As she ate, I noticed her collarbone jutting out beneath the thin fur. She was nothing but skin, bones, and fear. When she finished, she curled up beside the blanket, not on it, too cautious for that, but close enough that I could hear her breathing. I slowly reached out my hand, letting it rest on the ground near her. For a few heartbeats, she stayed frozen. Then her nose twitched. She sniffed my fingers, eyes weary, but softer now. Her paw brushed against my hand. It wasn't much, barely a touch, but to me it felt like the beginning of something sacred. That night, back in my cabin, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wood made me think of her alone, out there in the freezing dark. I turned on the small radio. Some local news station was talking about wildlife rescue centers in North Carolina and how donations helped during the harsh winter. The announcer's voice faded behind the crackle of static, but one phrase stuck with me. Kindness saves lives, even the wild ones. That I looked out the window. The moon hung low, brushing light over the snow-covered pines. Somewhere out there, she was curled up beneath the stars, maybe dreaming of warmth. I whispered into the quiet, "You'll make it through the night, little one. You have to." And for the first time in a long while, I felt a reason to wake up early again. The next morning came quiet and gray. The fog clung low between the trees like ghostly breath, and the road looked almost the same as it had yesterday, lonely, wet, and half hidden under a veil of mist. I hadn't meant to drive back so soon, but something in my chest wouldn't let me stay home. The memory of that little bobcat's trembling body and those pleading eyes had followed me through the night. I parked in the same spot near the curve and turned off the engine. For a moment, all I heard was the ticking of the truck's cooling motor and the far-off drip of melting frost. Then faintly came a sound, soft, broken, like a whimper carried on the wind. "Easy, girl," I said, stepping out. "It's just me again." At first there was nothing. Then from behind a tangle of wild briars a small shadow moved. She emerged slowly, limping on that wounded leg. Her fur looked damp, her tail dragging. The cut on her back leg had grown angry and red. My heart sank. She'd survived the night, but barely. I crouched, keeping my distance. "You remember me, don't you?" I asked, quietly. The man with the food. She didn't growl this time. Her ears were still flat, but her eyes didn't burn with fear. Instead, there was exhaustion, a kind of surrender. I laid another piece of chicken on the ground, and she crept forward. I could see her ribs move like the slats of an old porch under each breath. When she reached the food, I noticed her leg shaking so hard she nearly fell. I couldn't take it anymore. I removed my jacket and spread it on the ground near her, hoping she'd take it as shelter. For a second, she froze, confused. Then, she sniffed the fabric, stepped onto it, and lay down. I stayed there, the mist wrapping around us like an old blanket. Something about that moment reminded me of when my wife Margaret used to rescue stray cats back in Asheville. She'd always say, "Every creature wants to be seen, Henry. That's all." I hadn't thought of that in years. The bobcat blinked slowly as if the sound of my voice calmed her. I reached into my pocket for the phone. There was barely a bar of signal, but I managed to search for a veterinarian near Boone, North Carolina. Dr. Alice Parker's name came up along with a number for a 24-hour emergency animal
Clinic.
The search page also showed a small ad about pet insurance and animal care donations.
But what I really saw
Was hope. Maybe she could help me treat the wound before infection set in.
when
I called. A gentle voice answered. This is Dr. Parker. I hesitated. Ma'am, I found a wounded bobcat by the mountain road. She's small, maybe a few months old. I don't think she'll make it without help.
there was a pause, then,
You shouldn't approach a wild bobcat.
sir,
They can be unpredictable. But if she's as weak as you say, keep her calm.
and warm.
I'll drive up there with a tranquilizer kit. Just don't try to move her yet. I hung up and looked back down at the little creature. Looks like help's on the way, sweetheart, I whispered. She raised her head at the sound, those gold-green eyes dim but watching me closely. The minutes stretched, the cold a bit
Deeper.
I built a small fire using branches from the roadside ditch, careful to keep it a few feet away. The warmth must have reached her because she stopped shaking. Every so often, she'd glance up at me as if checking that I was still there. When Dr. Parker's truck finally appeared through the fog, flashing yellow lights reflected off the
Mist.
She stepped out. A tall woman in a heavy parka carrying a small cage and a first aid kit. That her? She asked.
Softly.
I nodded.
She's hurt bad.
Dr. Parker crouched low, speaking in that same slow tone she'd used with frightened dogs. Hey there, beautiful. You're a tough one, aren't you? She eased closer. Syringe ready. The bobcat tensed, let out a thin growl, then froze again. Good girl, the vet murmured. Just
Breathe.
within seconds, the medicine took hold. The little body went still, her breathing soft and steady. Dr. Parker checked the wound and shook her head. Deep cut, probably barbed wire. Infection starting, but she's lucky you found her. A few more nights and she'd
Be gone.
Can you fix her? I asked.
She
Looked at me over her glasses. We can try. I'll clean it up and start antibiotics. But she's still a wild animal. Mr. Miller. Henry Miller. Well, Mr. Miller, she said kindly. Once she recovers, she'll need to go to a licensed wildlife rehab. Keeping her here could be dangerous. Her words hit like a small stone dropped into still water. Dangerous, she'd said. But how could kindness be dangerous? Dr. Parker packed her equipment.
I'll
Take her to my clinic in town for a few
days.
You can visit if you'd like.
As
She lifted the sleeping bobcat into the crate. I saw a twitch, just a tiny flicker of her ear. Something inside me clenched. Can I ride with you?
she
Smiled faintly. Sure, but only because you're stubborn, Mr. Miller. We drove through the thickening fog, the crate resting between us. Every now and then I glanced down to make sure she was breathing. The rhythm of her tiny chest was steady now, like a heartbeat against the hum of the road.
You know, Dr.
Parker said quietly. People rarely stop for wild animals. Most assume they can't
be helped.
You did a good thing today. I looked out the window. I just couldn't leave her there. Felt wrong. She nodded. That's compassion. It's what this world needs more of. By the time we reached the clinic, dawn had fully broken.
The
fog burned away, revealing the quiet beauty of the mountain valley below.
Dr.
Parker carried the crate inside while I stood at the doorway, breathing in the
clean air.
When she returned, she said, She's stable for now, but if you want to see her again, wait a few days. Let her rest. I thanked her, left a small donation for the clinic, and drove home. The cabin felt strangely silent again. The firewood crackled. The old clock ticked, but the house seemed emptier than it had in years. That night, as I sat by the stove, I kept hearing her faint cry in the fog.
I knew I'd be back.
Some bonds, even between man and wild, start in silence but grow roots deep enough to change a life.
Before going to bed, I searched online
For wildlife rehabilitation in North Carolina and animal rescue organizations, accepting donations, not because I was planning to give her up, but because I needed to understand what she'd need to survive. And deep down, I knew the moment I saw her eyes in that mist, my life had already started to change. 3 days passed before I saw her again. The mornings were still heavy with fog, but now I drove toward town with a strange sense of anticipation, like a man waiting for good news. I pulled up outside Dr. Parker's small clinic, a white cabin tucked between pines at the edge of Boone. A faint smell of antiseptic and hay hung in the air.
Dr.
Parker met me at the door, her hair tied back, a mug of coffee steaming in her hand. "You came early," she said with a faint smile. "I couldn't help it," I admitted. "How's she doing?"
She
motioned for me to follow. In the back room, the little bobcat, Luna, I'd started calling her that in my mind, lay curled on a soft towel inside a metal
cage.
The wound on her leg was stitched and clean. Her breathing was steady now. She lifted her head when she heard my
voice.
"You remember me, don't you?"
I
whispered. Dr. Parker adjusted the
line.
"She's recovering better than I expected. Eating again, too.
Still
skittish, but that's normal."
"She's strong," I said.
"Too strong?" Another voice cut in from a hallway. I turned to see Ranger Tom Atkins, his tan uniform dusted with mud, standing in the
doorway.
His broad shoulders filled the frame, his eyes serious but not unkind. We'd known each other for years back, when I helped build the ranger station, before I retired. "Morning, Tom," I greeted. "Didn't expect to see you here." He nodded toward the cage. "I got a report about a wild bobcat rescue up the ridge. Figured it might be you." Dr. Parker folded her arms. "I called him
Tom.
The animal would have died otherwise. I'm not saying he did wrong," Tom said, "but rules are rules.
Wild
animals belong to the state. Once they're healthy, they have to go to an authorized rehabilitation center."
I
looked at Luna, still watching us with weary eyes. "And what happens after that?" "They release her back into the wild when she's ready," he said simply.
"That's how
it's supposed to work," Dr. Parker
sighed.
"It's not that simple, Tom. She's still too young. If we release her now, she won't make it through the winter." He rubbed his neck. "Then she stays under the sense care, not in a private cabin." I felt my chest tighten. "You saying I can't take her home?" "That's the law, Henry. I'm just making sure you understand it." There was a long silence. The hum of the fluorescent light filled the room. I could feel Luna's eyes on me, as if she sensed what was being said. Dr. Parker broke the tension. "Look, why don't we give her another week here? I'll report that she's still under treatment. That buys us some time." Tom looked at her, then at me. Finally, he nodded. "1 week. But after that, the paperwork starts." He left, his boots echoing down the hallway. When the door shut, Dr. Parker let out a breath. "Don't worry too much. He's doing his job. But you should start thinking about what's next." I stared at Luna. She blinked slowly, the way cats do when they trust you. "Just a fraction." "What's next?" I repeated quietly. "She's not just another wild thing to me, Doc." That afternoon, I helped Dr. Parker clean the cages just to stay close. The clinic phone rang twice. People asking about spaying, microchipping, pet insurance quotes, and one woman trying to donate to the shelter fund. Every ring reminded me how ordinary her workday was, while mine had suddenly become tangled with something wild and fragile. By the time I drove home, the sun had begun to fall behind the peaks, staining the sky orange and purple. I couldn't shake the thought of Tom's words. Rules, papers, centers. It all sounded like distance, like goodbye. At the cabin, I lit the fire and sat by the window. The silence of the woods pressed close, the kind that hums inside your chest. I poured a cup of coffee, the steam curling up like the fog that had introduced us. Then headlights flashed outside. A truck
Pulled into my drive.
Tom again.
He
Stepped out holding a folder.
didn't.
Mean to bother you, Henry. Just had to drop off the forms. Forms for the transfer. Standard stuff. You don't have to sign now, but the process has to move. He hesitated, glancing toward the cabin. Walls lined with old photographs. Margaret smiling beside me. The cabin we'd built, the fishing trips long past. His tone softened. You always had a big heart. But wild creatures. They don't belong in houses. Maybe, I said quietly. But she didn't
Choose to be out there either. He
sighed, removing his hat. Look, I'll hold off filing anything until the week's over. Just don't make this harder than it has to be. After he left, I sat there for a long while. The crackle of the fire mixed with the faint sound of night insects outside. The mountain air slipped through the chimney, cold and
sharp.
That night, I dreamed of Luna again.
She
was limping through snow, calling out, but no sound came. I woke before dawn, heart pounding, knowing exactly what I had to do. At sunrise, I drove back to the clinic. Dr. Parker looked up from her desk, startled. Henry, it's barely 6 o'clock. I know, I